Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
So, Bruchim Habayim, Boker Tov, welcome everybody. Delighted once again to delve into the...
Do we have to press God?
Press God. Yeah.
Continue.
Just place continue on that. That's
There you
okay.
go. Great.
So delighted that everybody is here this morning. Just before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this morning's Parashah Plus class is sponsored in appreciation by the Blankenstein, Weisglass, and Goodman families.
Very nice. Very nice. Thank you.
We'll thank them in person next time we see them. So you might think that Parshat Vayakhel, I mean, how interesting could it be if much of it is just a summary of all the actions of implementation and execution of the instructions given in early Parshiot. Much of it has to do with the perhaps assembly and placement of the various items. Some of it has to do, of course, with the vestments and garments that the priests are to wear. And then a wonderful ending to the Parsha, to this whole 5 Parsha description of the Mishkan from its beginning in Parshat Truma through Tetzaveh, Kitisa, last week's Vayakhel, and of course Pekudei, and telling us what happened at the very end. So that I find some fascinating elements in Pekudei. The first one is with the first word, Pekudei. So what does Pekudei mean? If you're following in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, you can find the beginning of the Parsha on page 564. And if you read the English translation, if you have another Chumash, we're talking about chapter 38, verse 21 in the book of Exodus. So it says, these are the records of the tabernacle. The tabernacle of the pact, which were drawn up at Moses' bidding, the work of the Levites under the direction of Itamar, son of Aharon, the priest. So let me just read that in Hebrew, because the words in Hebrew, hopefully there's some kind of familiar ring to them. I'm going to read slowly. Whenever a word sounds familiar and you know what it means, just raise your hand and I'm going to stop there. Ele Pekudei, okay, HaMishkan, Mishkan, Ha'edut, Asher Pukad, Al Pi Moshe, Avodat, Halviim, Biyad, Itamar ben Aaron HaKohen. All right, so glad to see that hands up much for every single word. Now, if I were to ask you, I'm not going to delve on all the words, but the important word is the name of the Parsha, because it's mentioned in different forms twice. It says Pekudei and Pukad. Where does that word, again, the English, probably the translation is not going to help you. You're not going to remember reading the translation of that word somewhere else, but maybe the Hebrew word rings familiar. Where have we heard that word before? Pakad.
Got engaged in like when somebody that you went to see somebody, is that? No, that's not the.
Pakid.
Pakid is a clerk. Is a clerk.
Yeah.
Okay. But we don't really read about, we do have the word Pekidim in the Tanakh, of course. We're going to be reading it in a couple of weeks. There is Pekidim in the Gillat Esther, the different clerks and assistants and that helped King Achashverosh in various tasks. We often imagine him as some inept nincompoop who needed good advisors and everything. Whether or not that's true, V'yafked hamelech pekidim. So the king appointed these clerks in order to do work for him. So you're right. There is this idea of somebody appointing v'yafked, lahafkid, to appoint somebody to a task. And a pakid is somebody who is given a task, a clerk. All right. But where in Bereshit? I'll give you a hint. Where in Bereshit and in the book of Shmuel do we read about somebody? Pakad also means to visit.
Yeah.
So, and we often talk about this idea that some divine essence or being visited somebody for a specific purpose.
What about Abraham, that he was going to be?
I'll read this to you. Vadonai pakad et Sarah kasher amar from Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah, yeah.
What do we read on Rosh Hashanah? Who visited Sarah and for what reason?
To tell her that she
She
was
would have a
going to have.
child.
She can have a child. So this idea of God visiting somebody to perhaps, if we play around with the word a little bit, to change the way the record has been. The record of Sarah until that point is somebody who's barren, who's not able to give birth. So the translation of Pekudei HaMishkan, the records of the Mishkan, God, by visiting Sarah, is changing the way the record has been registered to that point. If Sarah was registered in the Misrad Uchlosin, the Department of Population, or our Ministry of Citizenship, she would be registered as somebody who is childless, somebody without child, perhaps, if there was such a thing. But now God, by visiting Sarah, is to change that record to something else, somebody who does have a child. Who else does God visit? And why did I chant the Rosh Hashanah as opposed to the regular chant when we read that from the Parashah? Why would I use the Rosh Hashanah chant? Because we read that on Rosh Hashanah. Is that enough of a hint? Who else God visits in something we chant on Rosh Hashanah?
In the what's her name? Where
In the Haftarah?
Yeah, the Shmuel.
Hannah.
Shmuel.
Hannah, yeah. I just turned off the volume. I can't hear you because
Oh,
there we
Ruth,
go.
I'm sure must know what we're talking about. Ruth,
Right.
speak up.
So we read about Hannah, God, same
Right.
thing. God, the same verb is used with regards to Hannah. God visiting Hannah to change the record of a woman who is childless, barren, and give them the opportunity to be able to experience that wonderful thing called birth. I won't start asking you about your experiences, don't worry.
So if you went to, let's say in Israel, a fertility clinic, and with the Hebrew word that they would use would be, no.
They wouldn't use pakat. No, they wouldn't use, they'd use duach is a report. They wouldn't use that. It's a biblical word. It's not something you'd find in contemporary Hebrew for those very practical purposes. No, I'm stretching it a little bit, but I'm doing that because the translation here uses the word records. And if we think about it, when you visit somebody, you change the record. I'll give you another example. Somebody who's ill and somebody's sitting there. The shul keeps a record. We try to, at least. We don't often do it as well as we could, but we try to keep a record of who is ill and who gets visited and who has been visited, who hasn't been visited. So when you go to visit somebody, we need to change the record to indicate that that person has been visited, and so we know how better to follow up and that kind of thing. So this use of the word record and visit at the same time is a wonderful dual way of looking at that word pakad. A pakid, a clerk, somebody who keeps records for the most part. That's what we're talking about.
Faye. What's a pakid in
Faye
Hebrew?
knows
What's a
very well
female?
what those words mean.
What's a female pakid?
Practical experience. So why am I dwelling on this to excess, maybe we're thinking? Because there's a beautiful description of what happens here given by Rabbi Ilana Zeman. And what does she talk about when we talk about the Mishkan in this final stage? She describes the process of the Mishkan as a woman in labor, and now at the end of this parsha, giving birth. The Mishkan is being birthed in this final chapter here. And it's a beautiful image because we see this long process of gathering all the elements. This village of the Israelites, we gotta talk about a village to raise a child. So this village of the Israelites, from God to Moses to the artisans, Bezalel and all the others, Itamar, Aholiav, and all the Israelites are involved in this process of gathering what's needed in order for the Mishkan to be birthed. What do I mean by that? It means all the items that are donated, and you might look at that as a birth. Before a birth, what do we often do? Even with Ayin Hara, we purchase things. Some people are very superstitious about that. Never box something until a baby is born. But we do. We prepare. We prepare a room. There are some very moving films about tragedy, about families preparing, and of course something happens, that baby's never born. But we're talking about a community getting together to prepare for the birth of something very unique, something that's going to change the lives of the Israelites. And of course, the experience that God has as well, because we know that the Mishkan, even though we don't think of God as dwelling in a physical space, the Tanakh gives us very clear indications that God wants that Mishkan to be built. So I can dwell among them. I need to dwell, I need a physical space to be present. And as we'll see a little bit later, it says God's presence filled the Mishkan. In a sense, whether that's all of God's presence was all into this one space or part of God's presence, nevertheless, there's a physical description, a very tangible way of describing God's presence among the Israelites in this space that is now has now been prepared. So this idea that something has been birthed in order to change the life and give the Israelites a different way of relating to God. They have this baby, child, this infant to take care of. And it requires, that Mishkan is high maintenance. If you think about how many people are involved in terms of the priests, the entire tribe of the Levites, in making sure that that Mishkan is kept in its pristine, I shouldn't use pristine, but perfect condition. Everything has to be exactly as it should be. It's not something that can be left derelict, that can be ignored or neglected. And if you read the descriptions in Talmudic literature and in some of the Roman historians who describe the temple, and as well as Josephus, they describe how immaculately it was kept, how rich it looked with all the various gold and other elements. And when we read the description here of everything that was used and brought to prepare that Mishkan in the, it seems so unlikely and surrealistic. This group of people in the desert have this gold and silver and valuable cloth
Schlepping
and
it around. They
dolphin
carry it,
skin
schlepping it around.
and schlepping it around,
They carry it
exactly.
from place to place.
And the jewels
Yeah.
and all these shittim and the various wood that was used to build it. You think, where could they have possibly gotten that?
Another story.
We'll leave that for now, but the idea is that there's so much effort gone into bringing all those materials together, schlepping them from Egypt, let's say, or finding and trading with merchants who were traveling through the desert. We don't know. There isn't a lot of description about that, but it describes what was put into that. You might say it's perhaps a metaphor of what was invested in the temple in later generations, but nevertheless, there's a very graphic, tangible description of all these things that were used. And it's not just Moses, it's not just Aaron, it's the entire community. It says umpteen times, Vayasu Yisrael asher tzivad Moshe. Israel did as God commanded Moses to do. So this whole community is involved in producing, erecting this Mishkan and maintaining it. And it says a lot about what the responsibilities of a family are in terms of it's a great thing to give birth to something that is considered beautiful. And everybody says, we all do, oh, that's the most beautiful baby in the world. This element of, we would like to take perfection. Of course, we know that babies don't always turn out that way. But our experience is to try to see a baby as the ultimate work of creation.
It's a
And
miracle.
It is
a miracle.
it's a miracle.
Have they ever found
And
any?
just and what we need to do, and what the Torah is telling us by this description of how many people are involved in not just its construction, but in its maintenance, is like that's what you need to do with a child. You can't just create something that's beautiful and it's going to fend for itself or manage on its own completely. We all know that that's not the case. We're well aware of the fact that it takes an incredible amount of effort, and not just by parents, but by community, because we need that support in different times. So this idea of the birth, the Mishkan as a birth, is a beautiful example of how we perhaps can relate to things that we create ourselves. And the use of the word pakad in this sense is so appropriate, because if again, when you're familiar with the text in Hebrew, it draws you into those familiar stories of Hannah and Sarah. Why are they using this term? It reminds me of birth. And birth for a troubled potential mother, somebody who's not able to give birth. And you might see the Israelites as the most unlikely of groups coming out of slavery from Egypt, as those who might be able to manage this and sustain it, and yet they do. And that's the miracle of the Mishkan, the generosity, the nidvat libam, the generosity of spirit and heart that they demonstrated in not just gathering and donating all those materials, but in being part of this process of erecting it. Not just the artisans, but all the people who helped them.
Yeah, I have a question. This is the first time I hear it like this. So is this an interpretation that was ever provided in our learning, in our teaching in the past? It's the first time I'm hearing it this way. Now, maybe it's because I just didn't pay attention. I don't think so.
Well, I'm sharing this interpretation of the birth, the description of the birth from Rabbi Ilana Zimmer.
But is this a universal?
Etc.
Is this a universal interpretation now?
I don't think any interpretation is universal. Interpretations are very specific, and you might call, in a sense, provincial, because we don't often. Sometimes there are interpretations we accept, and that's mainstream interpretation. And there are interpretations like this, which I imagine does not speak to everyone. This idea of Mishkan as a birth, but I think she's not fabricating something out of nothing, as God might do. She's creating something from something that exists. She's using associations with those words, pakad, which can be very powerful. And this interpretation is saying, why would the Torah choose to use those words as she would believe, and as many of us do in other more conventional and traditional interpretations? Those words are used because those words have an intent of connecting us to a previous text. And this is a very powerful connection to those texts related to Sarah and to Hannah. And it makes a lot of sense textually to try to see some connection between the use of those words here. So it's not something that I imagine most people have considered or seen this interpretation. But there are many interesting commentaries out there.
Well, I thank you for bringing this to our attention, because it's a wonderful way of looking at the whole creation of what was happening.
But that's what we need to do with the Torah. We can't. I mean, Rashi is wonderful. Ramban is wonderful. Ibn Ezra, Abarvanel, all those medieval and slightly more modern interpretations are a fascinating basis, but a lot of them do not necessarily speak to us, and certainly don't speak often to kids. You need to find something that's they can relate to. But you need to help them relate to it through the text. You can't just come up with some wonderful idea about how to interpret this if it doesn't have some kind of basis in the text. That's the challenge. You can be creative, but you can't be, and this ties in with Parashah today as well, you can't be creative ex nihilo. You can't try to create an interpretation from nothing. Again, depending on your theological position, only God is able to create out of nothing. Everything we do, we create from something that we have available to us. The most creative artist, the most creative writer does not create from nothing. They base everything on something that they had in their psyche, in someone else's experience. I was just listening to something, it's kind of off on a tangent a bit, but I was listening to a discussion about acting the other day, different schools of acting. One school saying that in order to be a good actor, and this is what they call the method, Strasberg among others, this idea that you have to reach into yourself and draw some powerful emotion from some past experience and use that similar emotion for a character that you're using. But there's a very different school that says, no, it doesn't have anything to do with you. You have to live the character. You have to do background research to understand who that character was, what that character experienced, and then through imagination, try to act out what that character would have done. Very different, almost diametrically opposed schools, but they're both based on something that's there, either their character or something that you've experienced. You can't create an emotion out of nothing. You have to base it on something. And the beauty of this parsha, in the sense of creating, if I ask you now to turn, let's go just a little bit later, because this idea of creation I think is very powerful here as well. Go to page 568. if an eighth time flush. And let's look for a second at, let's go to verse 32 at the bottom of 567. And again, I'm going to read it very slowly in Hebrew. I want you to tell me if any of these words sound familiar. I'm going to read verse 32, and then I'm going to read verse 43. Listen carefully. Verse 32. Vatechel kol avodat mishkan ohel moed, vaya'asu b'nei Israel kechol asher tziva Adonai et Moshe ken asu. I'm going to read that in English. Thus was completed all the work of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. The Israelites did so, just as the Lord had commanded Moses, so they did. Okay, next verse, verse 43. Listen carefully to this one. Vayar Moshe et kol hamlacha, v'hinei asu ota, kasher tziva Adonai ken asu, vayevarech otam Moshe. I'll read it in English, although the English should be less effective. And when Moses saw that they had performed all the tasks as the Lord had commanded them, so they had done, Moses blessed them. Now tell me, does that sound at all familiar? Okay, I'm going to read, while you're thinking, I'm going to read something from another part of the Tanakh. Listen carefully. Tell me if this sounds familiar. Vayichulu hashamayim va'aretz v'chol tzva'am. Vayichal Elohim bayom hashvi'i melachto asher asa. Vayishvot bayom hashvi'i mikol melachto asher asa. Vayivarech Elohim et yom hashvi'i vayikadesh oto. Kivo Shabbat mikol melachto asher bara Elohim la'asot.
Isn't that the part of
That's the Kiddush. And that is the final element of creation, the 7 days. Let me read the English to that for you. The heaven and the earth were finished, and all their array. On the seventh day, God finished the work that he had been doing, and he ceased on the seventh day from all the work, malacha, that he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because on it God ceased from all the work of creation that he had done. Such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created. So if you compare those two phrases, those two endings, we have now, we talked about the birth as a process of creation.
the world?
Let's use that understanding of the connection with creation here as well. The Torah uses the same words, not exactly the same phrases, but the same words. Vayichal, it was completed. Moses completed. Vatechel, the work was completed. Go back to creation. And God completed the work, the malacha that he had been doing for those 6 days. Here they completed the work they had been doing for however many months. And the beautiful ending there, what is it? And it says, Vayar Moshe. And Moshe saw all that he had done. How often do we read about God? It's not that God did something and moved on to the next day. How do we describe God in creation? Vayar Elohim. We always describe God saying, and God saw that what God had done, and God saw that it was good. And then God moves on to the next thing. Only after God has taken the effort to look at something that God has created, does God move on to the next project. But this idea of seeing, acknowledging the existence, the creation of something, and sitting back and
I'm done.
nice job,
Did a good
nice
job.
job, kid.
He
Nice job.
used Moshe as his intermediary. This entire aspect of it is that Moshe now, like where God made the world, it's like he stepped back and then he was looking for intermediaries all along. Abraham,
He had
Isaac,
emissaries.
all of those people. But before we leave the whole thing, I have a question. Have they ever found archaeologically, have in any of the digs that they've done, have they found like this yarn that they're talking about yarn? Have they ever found evidence of the actual referencing to these
Garments
tools?
and the cloth that was used in the,
Yeah,
not that I know of, no. They found
Okay.
cloth that has survived, particularly in the desert, in the Negev, in Egypt. Cloth has survived in many places because of the
has, yeah.
extreme aridity.
So they know that there
But
was,
from the temple and Mishkan itself, no.
yeah.
Not that I'm aware of. No. So this idea of this creative process, on the one hand, birth, but on the other, even God, and that's why the comparison is so incredibly valid. Only at the beginning of creation does God create from nothing, it seems. On the other days, there are materials available that God has created, and from those, it seems that God creates things. And so the conclusion and the climax of the completion of the Mishkan is wonderful to compare to what God has done. And if you remember, even if it's a different element of creation, when God creates human beings, even woman is created not out of nothing, but woman, according to one of those narratives of creation, woman is created from the rib of Adam. So this idea of completion, the idea of acknowledging that a work has been done, the idea of seeing it, it's not enough to have created something and left it. You have to take a look at something. Any good artist, any writer, anyone who's creating something doesn't create it and say it's finished. Never. You have to look at it first. And it seems here, in a sense, there wasn't really a first draft and that it needs to be worked on, but still the process of acknowledging and checking it out and inspecting it to make sure it's what I want it to be. We see that happening both with God in the first 6 days of creation, and we see it with Moses here, making sure, Vayar Moshe, it says quite clearly, Vayar Adonai, exact same words, to make sure that this is what was in mind, and this is what needs to be done. And now it's finished, and I can sit back and hand it over to somebody else. Because when we continue, we won't go into the details today, but when you read, there's a fascinating discussion. Rabbi Aviv Richman explores this in greater detail. What was Moses' involvement here? What happens with Moses afterwards? We know that Moses, of course, once the Mishkan is finished, you might say, well, he's out of the picture now. It's the priests. Aaron, the two remaining sons after Nadav and Avihu are killed, and the other Levites who were involved in maintaining it. So what is Moses' function here? He has, in a sense, with the Mishkan itself, the commentators and the text, because it's a little bit ambiguous, Moses is the one who, according to one commentary, puts everything together. Because what do we read here? When it's complete, it says, I'm on the wrong parsha, sorry, 1 second. When all the items have been completed, what does it say that was done? If you turn to page 568, at the top, verse 33, just after the verse we read, it says, Vayaviu et hamishkan el Moshe, et ha'or v'kol kelav. It gives a whole list of everything that was brought. So it says Vayaviu et hamishkan. So does that mean they brought it as a structure prepared? They had enough people who were able to lift that whole thing and bring it and carry it to Moshe, so Moshe could check it out and make sure? No, the commentaries and even the text itself may hint at it. It says they brought all the various items, and Moshe is the one who put them together with help, but Moshe assembles everything. That's one of the interpretations. And only after that, it says, Vayar Moshe et kol hamlacha b'nei asu ota kasher tziva Adonai ken asu vayivarech otam Moshe. So Moshe blesses all those people who have helped him to assemble and put things in the right place. And it's interesting, after that, it says, B'yom hachodesh harishon b'chad lachodesh takim et mishkan ohel moed. So why do we know that Moshe was probably the one involved and it wasn't brought as a structure? Because God now, after all these elements are brought to Moshe, he checks out the individual pieces, then God says, and actually this is the first time in these two parshiot that God appears, other than the reference to having been the one who gave the instructions to Moshe that the Israelites perform. God has no involvement in Vayakel and Kudei. God is the one giving the instructions in Truma and Tetzaveh, but not here. God is absent. And I think I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago on Shabbat. I mentioned the fact that Moshe, one of a modern commentators, says Moshe was kind of taking a chance here. Like, the Israelites had donated everything and we're ready to go. It's after, if we follow the chronology of the Torah, after the golden calf. So what do I do now? Is God really forgiven us? Should I go ahead and build the Mishkan? Are things back to the way they were before? Should I take a chance? Like God hasn't given me any instructions to continue. What do I do here? So Moshe goes ahead. Vayakel Moshe, at the beginning of last week's parsha, he gets everybody together, all the people who needs, and he goes ahead and does it without any instruction from God. God had only mentioned it before. Again, if we follow the chronology of the Tanakh, of the Torah here, God had only mentioned it before in Truma, Tzaveh, had given the instructions, the injunctions. But now that everything has been assembled and gathered together and donated, God is absent. God's not there. So this one commentator says, well, I'm just going to go ahead and do it. I'm going to assume that God has forgiven us and God is ready. And throughout all these actions in Vayakel and Pekudei, God does not appear until now. And when does God appear? Only after Moses sees that everything has been done according to the instructions, and Moses, like God in creation, sees that it is good. Only after God sees that Moses has approved everything done till now, does God reappear. And what was God say? The Lord spoke to Moses saying, on the first day of the first month, first day of Nisan, coming up to that in a month and a bit, place the Ark of the Pact, set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. Okay, you know what? You took a chance. I'm playing a little loosely with the text here. Moses, you didn't really wait for my instructions, but I admire your initiative. You took a chance. You got it all together. Everything's been assembled. Everything has been constructed. Now, you feel it's good. I'll go with your decision. That's fine. Go ahead. Set up a tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and let's move on with our relationship. So the order here of the events is fascinating. God only appears after Moses has approved everything that's been done. And of course, Moses approved for the 20th, if not more times, that everything has been done. Kasher tziva Adonai ken asu. And I can't tell you how many times, I don't remember, I didn't count them, but it's at least 15 to 20 times that it says here, everything was done as instructed. Everything was done as instructed. They did what they were told. They did according to the instructions that God gave Moses. Everything according to plan. It says that over and over and over, which may tell us something else about a significant project, whether it be bringing a child into the world or building some kind of structure. You have to have a plan. You have to have motivation. But you have to be able to adapt as you go along. You have to check at every stage. I mean, we know of stories where a mother in labor, where there isn't proper care and follow-up and checking, we know that certain tragedies have happened because that hasn't been done. So whether it's with a child or whether it's with a building project, putting in an elevator in a synagogue, every stage of the work has to be monitored and checked. You can't assume that everything is going to be followed according to plan. You have to be on top of things. So this is another very practical instruction how we should live our lives. The Mishkan is a beautiful metaphor for what you need to do in order to find creativity and motivation to think up a special project like that. What you need to do to involve the right people to manage that project. What you need to do in terms of checking on a regular basis, and what you need to do afterwards to have the right people in place to sustain that project. Don't just assume, even if it's been done perfectly, if it's not maintained properly, it's not going to last. And it's not going to continue to be a source of inspiration for people if you neglect it. And as a matter of fact, if people see you neglecting something, of course it's going to turn them off. Even if what you've built remains beautiful, if the people who built it and were involved appear to be neglectful, then that takes away any motivation to continue to be involved in something. And that can apply, I don't need to
Applying
go
to our present day state of affairs.
It can apply to anything. So I think part of our motivation to study Torah, and I've told you this many times, I always have interesting but brief discussions with my partner about the Torah. And
Who wins? Who wins?
I try. It's not a matter of wins. It's a matter of how much we listen to one another. But I always try to convince her and myself that there is an incredible amount of relevance in the Torah and in all ancient texts. If you take them literally, yeah, they don't seem like something that you'd want to read other than for historical research. But if you're willing to explore text and find connection between text and modernity, I think any inspired text, however and whoever wrote it, however many years ago, is written with something that has permanence to it. If it's good, any writing, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, if it's any good, it has to have something that has sustainable relevance. If it's only something, even if it's a historical piece, that can only be seen as relevant now because that's, or for that specific historical period, then that writing is made good, but it's not anything that's going to be fantastic. It's got to be something that you can identify with elements of that writing, with the quality of the writing, the content, the style, and the opportunity for interpretation. That's something that's going to be relevant for you. If it doesn't offer you that, and if you're not willing, because you're an equal partner in that, if you're not willing to do that delving, then you are not making the effort, and the writing may not be as good as it is. And when I talk about writing, I talk about the Torah as well. I'm convinced that regardless of who wrote the Torah, there is incredible opportunity for relevant contemporary interpretation of that Torah. But you got to be willing to do that. You can't stick with a specific provincial commentary, I'll call it, that doesn't attempt or doesn't take a risk at being a little far-fetched. Not every commentary, not every interpretation is good or relevant, don't get me wrong. And certainly not everything that I've said, my understanding of the Torah is necessarily good or relevant. But you got to be willing to take a risk and sometimes come up with something that isn't great. But that's fine. That's any creative process. Sometimes you do things that don't work. And that's the last thing I'll relate to today, because we go on for a lot of different aspects of the Parashah. The last thing I'll mention, and this is something I found in a book by Rabbi Vernon Kurtz called Encountering Torah. I was just reading it yesterday, and he has a beautiful interpretation about Pudei. There's a place where it says, after Moses is now getting things in place, literally, what does it say? It says, after God's instruction, at the beginning of chapter 40, what does God say? The Samta Sham et Aron Haidut. So you put the Aron Haidut there, you put the, and what are you supposed to put in Aron Haidut? What goes into the ark that's been built, this beautiful ark with the Kruvim on top of it?
The Ten Commandments.
The Third
The
Commandment.
Luchot. And so it's interesting, the phrase that's used is called Ha'edut. The pact is the way they often translate it in the English here. And Rashi explains it as, one second, Rashi explains it as Luchot. It doesn't say the Luchot. Edut, the pact, the testimony. So Rashi explains that as the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances, the 10 commandments on those two tablets. But there's a beautiful midrash that Rabbi Kurtz brings out and says, it's in Numbers Midrash Rabbah, Numbers Rabbah, Bamidbar Rabbah, and it says this. It's not evident, but it says the tablets and the broken fragments of the tablets were deposited in the ark. It doesn't say that in the Torah. This is a Midrash Rabbah, commentary. It says that both the second set of Luchot that Moshe brought down, as well as the ones that Moshe shattered. Whoever had the foresight to pick up those pieces and realize their value, I don't know, but there are always people like that around who see a potential for some souvenir. Anyway, so this Midrash says that Moses puts all in there. Why would he put them in there? So Rabbi Kurtz has a beautiful explanation. The Midrash Tanchuma says the broken tablets of law are still holy. Why? Why would they still? They have God's name, of course. What do we do with items that have God's name? We put them in a gnizah, or we can't burn them. We can't throw them in the dump. So we store them somewhere, or we bury them in the ground in a plot, and we treat them with dignity. So that's the reason, according to Midrash Tanchuma, that they saved those tablets. But as I said, Rabbi Kurtz has a more interesting one. I'm just going to read a little bit from what he says here. I would like to suggest a more human-centered approach to the question. Throughout our lives, we are motivated by a set of goals that are framed by our dreams. David Levinson, in his book, The Seasons of a Man's Life, suggests that each of us evolves through life's transitions. He explains how in early adulthood, a person has to form a dream, create an initial structure in which the dream can be lived out, and attain goals through which it is in some measure fulfilled. In middle adulthood, his task is to modify or give up the dream. Each of us is the product of successful dreams and fractured wishes. We want to be successful in all of life's endeavors, but we know that no one is granted that desire. Our lives contain both the complete set of stone tablets and the shattered pieces of broken commandments. And why is it important to keep those with us? Because if we want to appreciate the adaptation that we've made to our initial dreams and know where we are and the journey we've taken, we have to acknowledge that we haven't accomplished everything we wanted to. We have to realize some dreams were shattered, some dreams were never fully realized, some dreams we chose not to follow because we decided that's not really what I want to be doing. So if we keep those broken pieces of things that never came to full fruition, I think we're better off as human beings as a result. And if we acknowledge for others, as we do for ourselves, that not everybody has the opportunity to fulfill and realize their dreams to the greatest extent, then we can learn to be much more sensitive of pain others have experienced, the frustration, the disappointment that they've gone through in not getting to where they might have imagined themselves 20, 30, or 40 years ago. And so I think it's a beautiful way of looking at this. Yes, the idea that we have God's name. See, that's a traditional explanation, and that would satisfy a lot of us. But there's no reason why not to take the creativity that Rabbi Kurtz instilled in his understanding of this text to something that can be incredibly meaningful for us as human beings, as sensitive human beings. So with the different creative interpretations we have explored today, and as always, my suggestion to you is take risks when you're interpreting Torah. And don't be afraid to say something or think something that others, and maybe even you, may think, oh, that's sacrilegious, that's profanity, that's not appropriate. There's nothing wrong with exploring things. You can decide with various criteria whether, in fact, that is a good explanation, a good understanding. But if you shut it off before you even explore it, then you're most likely shutting off a lot of good ideas that you might consider are good. So my suggestion is always be brave, courageous with your interpretations. And when you share them with others, there's a much greater opportunity of deliberation and collaboration and deciding together whether in fact, that interpretation and understanding can be a relevant one. So
I think in connection to that, what's important is that we always have a link, that it's important for us to take those progressive steps, but there has to be, as you mentioned, there has to be a link to the text somehow. Somehow it can't be independent.
Independent and, as I suggest, ex nihilo, out of nothing, coming from no basis whatsoever for interpretation. And that's why it's important to study with other people, because other people bring that perspective and say, Barb, that's a great idea, but that's got nothing to do with what the text says. There's no indication that could possibly be. And even then we may be wrong because we're too stuck in the way we see things. But still, we need that feedback. And that's why it's so important to be studying with other people when we study, I think, anything, any type of literature, our Tanakh, any type of.
Michael?
Sorry, Sharon wanted to say something, so let me allow her to offer a comment. Go ahead, Sharon.
Okay, I was just wondering, is there anywhere in the text which says how long it took for the tabernacle to be made? Like,
it's a great question, and I'll to be honest, the question, in case you didn't hear it, was: is there any indication in the text how long it took for the Mishkan to be prepared, to be assembled, until the final dedication? So I was thinking that it would be very simple for me to tell you from what the text says or what commentators say. But Sharon, I'm going to leave that with you. do that with you.
We've
Yeah, yeah,
gone
yeah.
through this
Do a
before,
little
Michael. I don't
exploration.
always,
Even if you
I
use
can't
Google,
always
that's
make
fine.
it to the sessions.
Sources.
So I can't always make it here, so that's why. Today I'm here. If I have a
Maybe it is
question, if you
9.
don't know, it's fine.
Or maybe it's 9.
No. I want you, the answer is actually the text itself. But I want you to explore that. You don't have to be here to research something, share that answer.
Where would we look in the text to find it?
Look at
It's here, it's here.
Dr. Google.
it's not something you need, it's not something you need to explore to any great extent. It's there. It's there.
Like,
Okay.
the interesting thing is that if you take this interpretation that you just gave about the broken
Use
pieces,
the variant.
Maybe it
it's
was 9
a
months.
coded behavior. It's a way of operating. It's something that's extremely, it's a very positive way of looking at shattered dreams and pieces that don't fit. We've talked about this before. There's an element throughout the Torah of almost being, there's some punitive approach. There's always some stick at the end of a lot of these things that happen. Interpreting it that way is actually, it heals the process that happened when they broke the when they caused the tablets to be broken. There is a purpose in having the tablets broken. It did fit into their lives. It allowed them to take broken pieces and look at them as broken pieces, but they work for what the future could hold, as opposed to God punished them and they had to work harder, they had to do something, and Moshe actually got punished. So, that's very positive.
Well, that's because anytime we look at text, we always have this idea of, if you look at the traditional interpretation of Pardes, this idea, remember in the Talmudic story of the 4 rabbis going into the Pardes, the orchard, and each exploring a different level of interpretation, Pshat, Remez, Drash, Sod, however we interpret that. So every text, people have different motivation and different ability to delve into a text and to see different levels of understanding. And that's the beauty of any text. So you can take things that's shot in a literal sense and try to understand it. That's what perhaps most of us do on a regular basis. And it takes great effort to look beyond that and to try to delve into other layers. And I think, as I said, the beauty of any text is that it has layers to it. Whether you designate them Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod is not the issue, but there are layers. And it's a matter of how intent and committed you are to explore those other layers beyond the literal. But again, that's with any writing.
We weren't taught that. Absolutely.
Like any good fiction, if you look at fiction, fiction has Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod as well, if not using those terms. There's the story, there's the clear narrative, but there's a lot of underlying layers. And trying to understand fiction is understanding, reading, if it's taking place in some historical setting, researching that historical setting so you understand all the ramazim, the hints that the author may have creatively put in there. It's reading about the background of the author. What motivated that author? Why is that author writing like that author does? That author must have experienced something that influenced and impacted for that story to come out as it did, and that specific story. So it's up to a reader to how much responsibility and initiative they want to take in terms of understanding the text to various levels and depths. Barb.
From an artistic point of view and simplistic, if you start with a sketch, you have an outline and it's just your flat paper. You start with your tabula rasa, your blank page, and you do your sketch. And then the artist will have something in mind and will start to add some composition and a little bit of detail. And then the next step is, where's the light coming from? How do I give it some kind of depth? And then what do I do with color? So you are reworking your initial plan. And we call it editing when it comes to writing. With artistic, you're sort of almost never satisfied, but you come out eventually with a 3-dimensional, colorful, realistic something that talks to you, but you've had to rework it either according to your mind or according to your heart or according to feelings. And I think that works through any kind of art or written work, or taking this from a superficial initial reading where you just take it literally. And that's what I did, first of all, because I didn't know any better. And I just read and said, okay, this is what they're saying. But now after 3 years, my goodness, there's such depth and so many layers, and it's fascinating. So as an artist, that's what you go through, and as an author, that's what you go through, and as I guess Torah studies, this is what we go through.
As a person who studies, that's what you hopefully go through. And not only the creation, I think, needs to have that statement at the end, Vayar Moshe or Vayar Elohim Kitov. Somebody who's reading something has to say, Vayar. People say, yeah, that's good. Or yeah, that understanding I have of this, that's good. I'm glad I got to that. You want to get to that point.
Thank you for that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
This is excellent.
Yeah,
Yeah.
beautiful.
Lynn, Ruth, Mika, anyone have any comments, questions? All right. Well, it was a pleasure studying with all of you as always. And our next one isn't for a little while, but we look forward to the next opportunity.
Are you doing this every 2 weeks? No.
Usually. So Chodesh Tov, everyone. And,
Why aren't you doing it every 2 weeks?
And what
Thank you.
next?
2 weeks.
Thank you, Michael. And the concert was wonderful.
What are you doing for the